Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Alan Tran. I will be your moderator today for our fantastic panel session with three amazing speakers. So today we're discussing the funding global development, and we're looking at how these different organizations look at their priorities for the next 3 years. So before we begin, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. So the University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and the custodian of the land on which we meet. We pay our respects to our ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australia and the global society. And our panelist members are coming from Melbourne, Canberra, and all the way from Seattle as well. So they're also acknowledging their Indigenous communities. So I'd like to introduce you today to the format of our program. And so what we'd like to do is welcome all our panelists and ask them to give an introduction. And then that will happen for the next 10 minutes. And then what we're like to do is open up the session to all our participants to be able to have a really engaging and open discussion about the priorities. We'll have a Q&A session, and if you do have a question, we'll ask you to turn on your video and your audio and ask the panelists questions. And so hopefully we'll have a really lively debate of backwards and forwards. And at the end, we'll talk about how you can get involved in the global development hub here at UQ, and any other ways to engage with development in general. So now we want to begin. I'd love to introduce you to our three distinguished panelists. We have Pippa Zainoeddin from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She is the Deputy Director of the Philanthropic Partnership Team. We also have Dr. Okello, who is the Program Manager for Research at the Livestock Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. And we also have Alexander Schmidt from Accenture Development Partnership, who is leading the Australian and New Zealand section. So I'd love for Pippa to discuss her challenges in the global development and funding at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Great, thanks so much for having me. Really happy to be here. So as Dr. Tran mentioned, my name is Pippa Zainoeddin. I work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is the largest private family foundation in the world. We make about $6.7 billion of gifts a year to about 1,400 grantees globally. That puts us ahead of Canadian aid at $6.2 billion and Australian aid at about $3.4 billion a year. So we're a large source of funding for development. And one of our core beliefs is that generosity is a human instinct, but the question is, how do you actually give at scale, and how do you give with impact? And we believe that philanthropy has a unique role to play alongside the public and private sector, primarily one to provide risk capital in ways that perhaps the public and private sector won't be interested in taking risk in funding for development. And secondly, we can take the long view. We're not tied to political cycles or quarterly earnings reports, and that puts us in a unique position. So the team that I'm on, the Philanthropic Partnerships team, is designed specifically to inspire and enable more informed and intentional generosity to improve outcomes globally. And our flagship program is the Giving Pledge, which some of you may have heard of. It's Bill and Melinda and Warren Buffett's efforts to get the world's wealthiest to commit at least half of their wealth to philanthropy. So a lot of my work is around how do you give at scale as an individual? How do you think about impact? And how do you give more, better, and sooner? So happy to talk about each of those things. Thank you. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Pippa. You've got a huge global reach, and that funding pool that you're talking about, that's quite significant. So thank you so much for being part of the panel. We'll definitely touch onto those points very soon. And Akello, would you be able to discuss your role in the next priority in 3 years? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anne. So my name's Akello, and I manage the livestock systems and One Health research programs at the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, otherwise known as ACIAR. So ACIAR is really the specialist food security agency within the Australian aid program. We work alongside our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, but we're a statutory agency within that. So we really focus, as I said before, on food security. We're also a research for development agency. So we fund research for development partnerships between Australian and international researchers and those in governments and private sector, and also academic institutions in our partner countries. So the Australian aid program has a geographic footprint from East and Southern Africa right across to the Pacific. And ACIAR has offices in 10 countries at our diplomatic posts in those regions. So East and Southern Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. And we're made up of about 10 research programs, each with quite a commodity focus. So obviously I manage the livestock systems. We also have programs in forestry, cropping, horticulture, a social science research program, an agribusiness research program, and a newer program in climate change. And there's a couple of other soils and water, of course. So I guess in terms of thinking about, where we've come from, this is our 40th anniversary this year. We were established in 1982. Where we're going, I guess, and we'll probably talk about this more in the next sort of hour or so, but, systems are becoming increasingly complex. A lot of people talk about wicked problems and wicked development problems. How do we fund research for development partnerships and ensure we have strong partnerships to address these increasing complexities, not just in terms of food systems and our agri-food systems and the impact on how do you grow enough food to feed enough people, whilst also maintaining a good balance with environmental health and human health and nutrition, but also geopolitical complexities as well. So shifting world post-COVID, what are things going to look like, and what is the resilience of those food systems in our region, and how do we design research that contributes to that research impact pathway and contributes to those sort of more robust development decisions down the track. So I guess for ACIAR, we've got a good history of working in quite thematic areas, programmatic research, quite technical research. The challenge moving forwards that we're all talking about here is how do we integrate, how do I integrate livestock with crop systems research, for example? How do we integrate thinking around social science and agribusiness into our value chains to provide sort of more cross-sectoral and cross-sectorally designed research programs to address, the pending issues moving forwards. So thank you for having me, and look forward to chatting more on these things in the next hour or so.
Thank you, Anna. Happy birthday to ACIAR. That's wonderful. And I saw that Pippa was really nodding quite vigorously when you mentioned wicked problems and how complex it is. And so it's really great to have panelists coming from different angles, but then all working towards a very common goal. And then lastly, but not without leastly, Alexander Schmidt from Accenture. I'd love you to have the floor to discuss your role in development and the priorities that your organisation is looking forward to in the next 3 years.
Great, yeah, thank you very much, Anne, and thank you for having me today. And yeah, thanks for all the people who are joining today to listen in. Really excited to be here. So my name is Alex. I lead Accenture Development Partnerships program for Australia and New Zealand. So a little bit about Accenture. Accenture is a global professional services company. We work in around 120 countries across the world. We work with some of the biggest organizations, I think 95 of the Fortune 100 companies, and we offer services across strategy and consulting, digital and technology, and also operations. Accenture Development Partnerships is a purpose-driven, mission-driven consulting practice within Accenture. So we work with some of the world's largest NGOs, foundations, donors, companies, and governments to address complex development challenges. So our model is really about bringing the best of Accenture. We have a workforce of about 700,000 people now, last I checked, across the world. So bringing the best of that talent and experience to the international development and social impact sector through a unique co-investment model. So Accenture Development Partnerships runs as a not-for-profit program within Accenture globally. So we're able to co-invest in our projects with our partners. In terms of our priorities, Accenture Development Partnerships in Australia is relatively new, but we have a well-established program and practice across Asia Pacific and globally. In Australia, we're really looking at partnering on some of those large donor-funded programs. We often work directly with NGOs, and sometimes that's funded by private sector partners. And we're also quite often helping organizations figure out the question around funding. So really thinking about how can we attract more funding, how can we be more successful, but also how can we diversify our revenue streams into more kind of sustainable revenue streams and business models. In terms of the thematic areas that we look at, Accenture Development Partnerships specializes in agriculture, energy, financial inclusion, gender inclusion and diversity, health, humanitarian response, livelihoods and education, and climate and environment. So we have dedicated practices within each of those impact areas. But as I'm sure we're going to discuss today, there's a lot of intersection between all of those. So there's an increasing kind of, blend of the work we do on our programs that bring many of those areas together and the skills from our wider business. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's really useful to understand the context. And coming from a university setting as at the University of Queensland, I would like to pose the first question if possible. Just in general, we have a lot of academics, staff, students, and external partners that are really interested in development and how we all can be involved. And so I'll open this to all three panelists. The question regarding how can academics and researchers in general be involved and integrate our work into development projects. Maybe Pippa, I'll ask you to start off with.
Happy to. So, I mean, at the Gates Foundation, we rely heavily on university partners to implement a lot of our 40 foundation strategies that range from polio to water and sanitation to agriculture. And I think probably one of the most important roles that universities can play is producing the data to help policymakers make data-informed decisions. The number of times that policies get put through because of sort of a political posture or perhaps other factors is just sort of way too common. And I think the importance of data-informed policy is probably one of the most important reasons why we at the foundation invest in universities. I think probably a second reason that is complementary is the role that universities can play in partnerships across the global north and the global south. Too often funding goes to sort of the the top 50 universities to conduct their research. And we at the foundation really believe in building up the universities of in countries and lower income countries as well. And so I think universities can play a really great sort of networking, sort of network effect role in helping sort of strengthen the landscape of research and funding for development.
That's very encouraging here, Pippa. That's wonderful. And Anna, from a research organization that partners with other people, how would you respond to that question?
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, a bit like Pippa said, I mean, I've spent 20 years integrating research and development. That's what I've been doing. And obviously ACIAR works very much in that space. I think there's a lot of application. I think particularly in my area, so I'm a veterinarian, and then went on and did sort of PhD, and a lot of my research has been in social and political science. And I think it's important to sort of think outside the box. You know, universities are often quite siloed in the way we approach things. I'm the same. I teach at Edinburgh University where, you know, we work in the Global Health Infectious Disease Department, but how do you apply that research knowledge in real world situations? And I think there's one arm, which is that sort of what I call the pointy technical research. In agriculture, you know, there's still lots of research questions around how do you produce food, how do you control disease, and the sorts of things that we look at ACIAR. But then there's a whole body of research that's around sort of implementation and integration science. How do you, you know, take that knowledge and apply it? What questions, you know, researchers, I think, you know, we look at research questions from often the academic perspective and the research perspective. But on the flip side, when you're working in that research policy interface, we need to understand those policy processes and understand that it's not necessarily a rational linear process where evidence gets put into policy, But, you know, how do things actually happen in the real world? How do decisions get made, particularly how do funding decisions get made? And I guess what I'm always pushing the researchers in my program to think around is, you know, how do you package up? You know some facts and you've done great research and you've got excellent results. But the next step is how you package that up and communicate it to the next end users to make sure that we're getting research impact. And for me, that's the crux, I guess, and that's the area I'm interested in as an academic, that research policy interface. And I guess what I always sort of say to people as well is you know who your audience is, understand how policy is made, who are your policy actors, and what are the questions that they've got in terms of how that research is applied, because the way policymakers ask questions and package evidence and make decisions based on evidence is often very different to the way that researchers would ask those original research questions. So for me, that's, as we move forward, we know how to grow food, I know how to control animal disease. There's lots of technical questions that have been answered, but the application of that is sometimes a bit more difficult. So I guess this is the area that ACIAR's, or at least the Livestock program, is moving in. Working more in that sort of policy space to ensure better research impact. And as Pippa said, you know, apply the critical decisions and the critical knowledge to development interventions and funding decisions.
They're very good tips, Anna. Definitely the translation of research into policy making processes. Thank you very much. And Alex.
Yeah, thank you very much. And completely agree with what both Pippa and Anna have mentioned, especially around the communications, making it really easily digestible and actionable for practitioners. I mean, with Accenture Development Partnerships, if we talk about development programming, we're quite often involved in kind of that research and design phase, but also the programmatic kind of implementation of development programs. So I think there might be, you know, interesting opportunities to partner, especially at the research stage, because, you know, I would imagine we both bring different things to the table. So what are ways that we can kind of work together, or you could work with organizations like Accenture or others that are involved in that at that stage. But then also, you know, how do we have the conversation so when we are going to be involved in implementation, that we're guided by, you know, some of the leading thinking in research. So, you know, how do we make that basically available to organizations like Accenture or some of the managing contractors or the NGOs that are, you know, doing the work, the implementation of these programs. So we're really guided by some of that best practice, and then have that feedback loop to research, so you know that can continue to evolve. So definitely an area of interest for me, and I would just say, yeah, look for the right opportunities to partner, and look for that kind of mutual capability. You know, mutual capabilities that might reinforce each other for greater impact.
Thank you, Alex. Definitely, partnership is definitely a key component of developing a great team to solve the challenges that we need today. I'd like to invite all the participants on the webinar, if you'd like to turn on your video, if you have a question to ask our panels, be brave. Do you have any questions from our panelists? Oh, sorry, from our participants? And Jess has mentioned that if anybody cannot use their microphones, then please put your questions in the chat box. Well, while you develop your questions, I do have a question from one of our participants, Leon Weisner, who asked, can startup companies be involved in providing development assistance, and how could they be involved and be supported? So that's a question about startups. Pippa, maybe I can ask you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think innovation can come from a number of different sectors. And so regardless of whether it's public or private sector, I think startup companies do play an important role in providing development assistance. I think it's a pretty broad question and category. So I'll say yes, it absolutely is possible. I think the challenge is how do you get sort of specific and sort of figuring out where the niche is and what is the value add that being private actor plays versus a civil society actor. And I think that's a really important lens to understand what is the comparative advantage when thinking about the impact that you want to have. Is being private startup the best option versus civil society organizations? So important to think through those aspects.
Yes, it is interesting to see how which group has some key elements to help with the overall partnerships and teams. Anna, I saw you nodding as well when we talked about startups.
Yeah, really to agree with Pippa. And for me, it always gets back to, you know, from a research perspective, the research impact pathway. So in a nutshell, I tend to sort of describe research impact pathways as research is done, and then you have to farm that off to the next and end users, who generally fall in, and I'm generalizing, 3 main categories, at least in my head. You've got your development partners, you've got governments and civil society organizations, and you've got the private sector, and the startups would fit sort of probably in that ladder. And yeah, and on top of that, you've got lots of sort of subdivisions of those 3 broad categories. But you know, as Pippa said, it depends on what the question is, who is best. That's the way ACIAR thinks as well. You know, in terms of research implementation and doing the research often differs from the next and end users. Often, you know, people further down that impact pathway are not the right groups to do the implementation or do the research design, but they very much have to be involved in that design in a co-design sense, because they're the ones that will uptake the results further down the track. So again, for us, we don't work so much with startups at the moment, but you know, often it's because of they're not a large group of next and end users in this part of the world compared to maybe, you know, I've done a lot of work in Africa. There's a lot of great work happening over there with startups. But you know, the Australian Aid program focuses more on Asia Pacific. Very happy to hear, you know, examples or, you know, hear from people in these areas that think they've got something to offer, because we're always looking for, as Pippa said, innovative ways to implement our research results.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna. I'm going to throw in a curly question before we open up to our participants again. And I'd like to start with you, Alex. So currently, the world is not on track for achieving our Sustainable Development Goals. And what do we need to accelerate or stop doing to achieve these goals? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that question, but I can have a stab at it. I think, you know, if you look at the amount of capital required, the estimations for achieving the SDGs, I think it's much larger than what any kind of government or development funder is going to be able to basically supply. So how do we look at the private sector and the you know, the capital that the private sector has available, also with the kind of increasing focus on ESG? How do we, you know, hold companies accountable to that, measure outcomes, and really encourage you know, private sector to be more involved in international development? And if we think about the Australian perspective, maybe thinking a little bit outside of our, you know, the national context, and thinking about Australia as being part of a region, and obviously with the things like you know, climate change and inequality, and what we're seeing at the moment with kind of global supply chain and disruptions. I think those impacts on, you know, on Australia are becoming more evident. So I expect to see a lot more involvement. But really, yeah, I think the private sector engagement is really key, and channeling that investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for going first with that. And I think you just threw the ball straight over to Pippa.
I know. I mean, it's the question that everyone is tackling with, right? Even before COVID, the World Economic Forum estimated, just as Alex was saying, something like a 2.5 trillion per year financing gap to achieve the SDGs. And so post-COVID, that gap has only grown. And I think one of the things that we're tracking at the Gates Foundation is the debt burden of a lot of lower income countries, because yes, private sector can play a role. Yes, civil society, private philanthropy can play a role. But the biggest source of funding is going to come from domestic resource mobilization of the countries themselves, being able to raise taxes to pay for the human services of education, health, economic development. And with, you know, the increasing debt burden that we're seeing across a number of lower income countries coming out of COVID, it's just, it's almost impossible for them to reach the SDG goals. So I think it's going to take a rethinking actually of our global financing structure to think about what it's going to take to help these countries grow. And that's, not, I think in the traditional sense of just sort of GDP, GNI, but really what does equitable economic recovery look like for all of these countries? And then with those sort of big sort of rocks in place, what role can the private sector play to support that? What role can private philanthropy play to solve that? They're just but smaller pieces of a larger puzzle that I think is really sort of held a lot at the government level in terms of financing this gap.
Thanks, Pippa. Yeah, definitely the private plus partnerships with government is really key and very important in developing the Sustainable Development Goals. And the fact that you're talking about local governments as well, that's really important. Now, Anna, would you like to also answer the question of what we need to do to move along with the Sustainable Development Goals?
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, I mean, really, as Pippa and Alexander have said, roles and responsibilities of it's easy for us to say, well, political will is needed. But, how do you dissecting that a little bit more? Is it really that we don't have the technologies to grow enough food for people, or know how to manage climate change, or know how to manage education and some of the SDGs? Is it, so where is innovation required? Where is more research required to answer some of those questions? Where is it simply a matter of more funding? And I say simply with a grain of salt. And where is it a matter of political will? And whose roles and responsibilities are these things? And again, in my head, I tend to break problems down into sort of, domestic financing issues, as Pippa's touched upon. What can nation states do within their own countries? What can regional bodies do at that next level up? And then what does the world have to do? When we talk about global public goods, one of the key catches for addressing global public goods issues of our time, such as antimicrobial resistance, climate change, pandemics, these sorts of things, one of the biggest challenges is we don't have a global government to pay for that. So, how do we sort of mobilize resources as a bunch of nation states together? How do we mobilize, platforms, regional platforms, and even global platforms? So through the UN system, but also through various private sector and philanthropic sort of opportunities to really sit down and say, well, this is the level of political will and agreement and governance that's required. This is the amount of money that's going to cost. And this is how we can move forwards in the next sort of 10 to 20 years. Knowing that some of these challenges like climate change are probably going to get worse. So I think, it's a lot of things together. It needs, and the trade-offs and benefits of any of these big sort of global policy decisions also have to be understood. And there's going to be winners and losers. That's political economy 101, what are we going to have to give up in order to make progress on some of these other more pressing issues, and what are our priorities as sort of individual nation states, but also as regions and the world at large, to make sure that we're moving in the right direction post 2030 and beyond, and how do we have those sorts of conversations? So again, I think research plays a really good part of this. Understanding that sort of broader political economy when we go to fund research and design research and be outward looking. I think that's sort of another thing. I think COVID's given the whole world a crash course in global public goods. And the reality is that we're not, able to sort of close ourselves off, and things that happen in other parts of the world actually do have an impact on us. So how do we sort of design research, I guess, from my position? How do we design research and make sure we understand those research impact pathways that are actually making a contribution to the knowledge behind those development outcomes?
Thank you, Anna, for bringing back that kind of global picture towards what individual researchers and research organizations can do in that kind of global context, and give hope that there is some solidarity globally about what we can do. Now, participants, I'd love you, if it's possible, to turn on your microphone and your video to ask our amazing panelists some questions. So Deb has a question. That's probably the International Development Group. Now, is there any significant failed development initiatives that you have experienced recently, and how can it impact future funding plans? Would any of the panelists like to take that one on first? Failures. It's an interesting topic.
I'm happy to have a go if you want.
Thanks, Anna.
Jump in. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot in the discourse around development failure. There's some great books that have been written about it. I'm sure anyone that's worked in international development long enough have seen sort of things from their own perspectives that could contribute to that thinking. I mean, for me, it gets back to the intent. Is the intent good? I don't think anyone ever goes into international development careers or research for development careers thinking, well, I don't want this to work and I've sort of, got to make a bad decision. But the reality is, I mean, it gets back to those trade-offs and benefits that I talked about. When we fund things in food systems, for example, the outcome from our part of, our perspective could be, well, we want to increase yields by X amount, or we want, more women and children having access to animal source foods and those sorts of things. And, that bit can be done and that bit can happen. But, others coming from other different areas or different perspectives might think, well, people going ahead and doing that in that context has actually caused rebound negative impacts for other things. So what does development failure actually mean? Are we looking at things as a holistic sort of sense, or is it, as long as people are sort of moving in the right direction, of course, there's going to be winners and losers from some of these things. But, as donors, I think we need to make sure that our eyes are open to the potential trade-offs of some of our interventions. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's the more we can have holistic approaches, the more we think about systems and think about where I come from, agri-food systems. What are the interventions in our agri-food systems that will ultimately improve health and nutrition of people? How is that having an impact on the environment, for example? And how do we make sure that things that we're doing in the food security space isn't, destroying forests or these other sorts of impacts? And I guess the more that we can understand these complex problems, the more we take a systems perspective in the design and communication of at least research where I come from. I think, we've got eyes wide open to the development failures and just making sure that we're learning from the past. And also thinking about sustainability. I mean, we say that a lot, resilience, these sorts of words come into development discourse the whole time. Different actors, different groups of people, different stakeholders have different perspectives on what sustainability and resilience mean and what innovation means. So, again, making sure that as much as possible, we're talking about, the same language and designing interventions for the greater good, and everyone's intentions are good. I think as, we keep learning from perceived failures and moving forwards as a whole. But yeah, it's a tricky subject because, and there's some great books, as I say, go back and read, some of the literature, and it's almost like, well, we have learned a lot, I feel, since, the 70s. And even in my career in 20 years, things that we were doing and saying 20 years ago, it's changed a lot. And, things like gender equity and social and disability inclusion and all the ways now that we think of even quite technical interventions, I feel that's really moving forwards. And, development issues, it's the same as policy failure in any space. It's mostly not intended when people set out to make those decisions in the first place.
Yeah, happy to jump in. And I love all those points you just made. And I think, failure is actually the key to development, right? It's like trying things out and seeing what works. And if it doesn't, then what, why, and then sort of moving on. I mean, at the Gates Foundation, I really appreciate we have these biennial reviews with Bill and Melinda, and the things we're supposed to report on are sort of how we spent the money and what our goals are, but we always lead with like, what did we fail at? What did we get wrong and why? And what did we learn from that? And so, I mean, I can think of a whole number of things that we failed out. One of our K through 12 programs around Common Core, which was a new set of education standards in the United States, and how we rolled that out, that was a bit of a failure in terms of we misjudged where there was political appetite as well as teacher buy-in for rolling out that curriculum. There was also the case of trying to advocate for 0.7% aid budget advocacy and working through think tanks to help influence decision makers. That didn't work out well. And I would love to tie that actually to the second question that's in the chat about one of the things we learned from both of those cases was how important it is to not have this sort of top-down approach of like, this is what we think the answer is, but to really work with local partners to say, what is it that you need? What are you seeing on the ground that is preventing you from achieving your goals? And how can we as a donor help you achieve that rather than put our assumptions onto you as to what we we think the problem is. So I think that has been a very marked trend at the Gates Foundation, is how do we think about working with more proximal partners, so partners who are closer to the communities whose problems we're trying to help solve. So I think that's been a huge shift for the foundation. We're not perfect at it yet, but in that spirit of innovation, fail, learn, try something new. That's been really key for us, is how do we diversify the partners we work with to really listen to people who are most impacted by the work.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, Pippa, because I mean, I completely agree around that kind of fail fast and learn mentality. And there was a question before about startups. I mean, I think, that startup kind of mentality and mindset of small experiments, how do we prove things are working and then scale? I think there's really a role for startups in development there, to be able to show, the bigger players or the organizations that are scaling these ideas, what's working and what's not, and making sure that that's locally led, as Pippa said. So how can we have some of those locally led solutions being involved in the process?
So for the participants who aren't on the chat, the question that Pippa and Alex have alluded to was talking about localizations and how funders and even universities can engage and better support localizations of development projects.
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of expand on a point. So one thing I didn't mention in my intro and bio is, prior to joining the Gates Foundation, I worked for an American mining company operating in Papua, Indonesia's easternmost province of Papua, working on their community engagement programs for the indigenous communities most impacted by the mines. And one of the things that we ran into was just, how to work with local partners that may be coming to the table with a very deep sense of what the problems are, but maybe not with the same resources or experience that larger universities like University of Queensland or other universities had to bring some of the data and the research. And so for us as a funder from the private sector side, we were really excited when there were universities like University of Queensland that could partner with universities in Indonesia to work together to sort of bring the expertise of both, to then try and take a sort of multi-perspective approach to solutions. And so I think that's going back to sort of a career before the Gates Foundation, that was a sort of a role that I think universities can play, is really working with other universities around the world to sort of share strengths and capacities on some of these really complex and sort of wicked problems that Anna was talking about, as well as Alex.
Anna and Alex, would you like to talk to the point of how local organizations can partner with research organizations to have those marginalized voices heard, not only amongst the people themselves, but also local development players?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there. Yeah, also agree with what Pippa just said. I think yeah, moving back to the focus on localization, how can we use really participatory design, using techniques like human-centered design when we're conducting our research, so we really have that kind of top-down and bottom-up view of partnering with organizations. I think yeah, there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done in terms of how localization happens when it comes to development programming as well, around the structure of our implementing organizations, around where kind of the skills will come from. There's questions around risk there. So I think also partnering with organizations to help them think through what localization might look like, and research around that area would certainly be welcome.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here from ACIAR perspective as well. I mean, I know, and I guess for that sort of co-design and partnering with in-country partners. That we've been doing that for 40 years. So we do take that very seriously, and all our projects are sort of co-designed and implemented in a joint sort of partnership process between Australian and or international partners like the CG, for example, and our local government departments or academics in country. I think, as others have said, it's super important, and I guess from a development perspective as well, it's, there's a comment in the chat around, power dynamics and those sorts of things. And I think it's important for us to realise that that just doesn't happen in our side of the fence, from the donor perspective or the Australian agricultural system. But there's those equally in the countries we work in. And if development professionals go into places and they don't understand the communities they're working with, they don't understand the social aspects, the culture, and they don't understand the power dynamics within these communities, then we can all, that's also not great. We need to sort of think about power dynamics and political will and politics the same way in our partner countries as we do here when we sort of design these programs. But I think too, one thing I'm really excited around is sort of this sort of South-South collaboration, I guess, and we do it a lot at ACIAR. I've got projects working with some GOATS projects, actually, so the genetic gains projects in Africa. How do we learn from those and integrate the same people that have been working in Africa and have those success into areas where GATES isn't active as much, like Southeast Asia, for example. There's been some really awesome examples of South-South collaboration where donors are funding things. How do we take that in areas that and apply that to different areas? And I think this sort of rise of voice in the South and South-South collaboration and learning across Africa, Asia, the Pacific, for example, and how do we have that two-way conversation quite openly and honestly? And it's not just the donors making decisions. And as donors, I think we've got a responsibility to listen, but also make good decisions and make the right decisions. But we can't do that if we're not, engaging our key beneficiaries in country. And it's much easier said than done. I think in many cases it takes time, it takes trust. Many of our relationships have been built up over 10, 20, 40 years in ACR. So I think these quick wins and quick fixes that a lot of donors look for, sometimes it's quite actually hard to implement on the ground, and particularly when you're doing research. So again, coming from UQ, working from a research perspective, things take a long time. You can't turn something around in 6 months. And as donors, we need to be cognizant of that. And, I think that's something I always say to all my teams on the ground. It's like, we understand these things take time. You can't go in and do stuff until you've sort of built up that trust with your collaborators and trust with the communities as well, and not to underestimate the amount of time that takes sometimes.
Yeah, Anna, just everything you said, amen, mic drop. That's like so true. It's so absolutely true. And it's one of those things too that I think grantees are sometimes scared or hesitant to go back to the donor and say, this is going to take longer, because exactly as you said, Anna, change moves at the speed of trust, right? And like, if we cannot turn around a result a year, 1 year from now, or even 18 months from now, this is much longer. And I think on the donor side, I respect grantees way more when they say, no, actually, this is what it will take. And they push back and say, these timelines, let's work on this together. What is it that why the urgency? And then here's the reason why I think this is going to take longer. So for all of you who are applying for grant applications, et cetera, don't let the donors timeline negatively influence the quality of the work that you want to do. Push back and say, this is actually how long it takes to do this well.
Well, this is an incredible conversation. We're moving from traditional kind of funding models where there's a north-south relationship, and I know you're talking about the south-south, and Pippa, you're agreeing with it. And there's this idea that we can push back as researchers and academics to our funders and say, actually, this is what really happens on the ground, because I think academics have a really strong understanding of that, because they work very closely with their partners. And I think that's key. Alex, what have you found in terms of partnering with communities on the ground, and how can academics and universities reach that space better?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just more from the perspective of Accenture, whenever we, as Accenture Development Partnerships, are engaging in international development, I mean, we'll usually be working with our local country office from Accenture in that country, wherever that's possible. So making sure, I mean, that's been a big shift, I think, in the way that we've gone about our programming over the last 20 years or so, is that, Accenture Development Partnerships used to be about flying in consultants from United States to Africa and doing work. Whereas now, it's much more locally led, which is a great change, I think. Also, from Accenture's perspective, partnering with local research institutions on those projects as well. And I think where universities have those relationships in country with other universities, how can we kind of truly collaborate and look for really the capability matches? So where might our local partners have strong capabilities, and where might we be offering kind of a different capability that might not exist with a certain partner? And that's certainly what we try and do when we're engaging in these programs as well. So yeah, I think just having the open and honest conversation, making sure that it's front of mind, and that we're really striving towards that. And going back to the point of failure, it's not going to be perfect, of course, the first time around, but if we go about this with good intentions and continue to kind of iterate and build out and be mindful of things like power dynamics, I think it can only get positive and more positive from there.
These are very forward-thinking thoughts here, panelists. I'm very impressed with the kind of understanding of development in that space, and that you're also aware of pushing the boundaries. Is there any questions or additions from our participants? Trung, are you trying to ask a question? No? Okay, so we've got about 5 more minutes left before we close, and I just wanted to have a really broad question for the panels about where the next 3 years, what are the challenges you are really facing? What are the priorities in the next 3 years that your organization is looking at? So maybe I'll start with Alex first, and then we'll go around.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sustainability as an umbrella term is really the focus for Accenture and Accenture Development Partnerships, and really that can encompass all of the SDGs if we talk about it, but particularly on kind of the elements of decarbonization, energy transition, just transition, and looking at the region and how we can enable that and make an impact in that area. Also working with the private sector and governments to both advise on that area. So it's definitely a huge focus for us, and I know aligned with some of the donor priorities in the area, in the region, around Southeast Asia and Pacific. Yeah, also looking at the intersection of climate and other issues like inequality, poverty, gender dynamics in society, and how climate change is affecting people differently, and different countries and vulnerable economies. So a lot of our focus will be in that over the next 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's very, very far-reaching goals there in the 3 years. Anna, would you like to talk to the point of your priorities for the next 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the food security space, it's hard to say what's going to happen. I mean, the shocks post-COVID initially, from at least our analyses at ACIAR, have been that these smallholder systems have been quite resilient. But what does that look like in the next couple of years in terms of rising inflation, rising fuel costs, wheat prices, these sorts of global shocks that are happening on top of the post-COVID sort of response? Food security is, eating as a fundamental human right. Everyone has to do it. We need to make sure that donors and everyone doesn't forget and just think that these food production systems are going to keep ticking along. I tend to describe to people, in my head at least, there's what I see as hotspots of food systems chaos, Horn of Africa, Mekong Delta, parts of Pakistan, they're coming off, there's a huge water crisis brewing over there. Like there's parts of the world that are going to be flashpoints in the next 20 years in terms of the millions of people that live there, and can those systems keep supporting that number of people in, growing climate challenges and all those sorts of things. So I think for us, making sure agriculture doesn't fall on the back burner, people just assuming that things will keep ticking along, food will continue to be produced and equitably distributed, making sure that technology and innovation is keeping up with that. And again, I think Australia's got a lot to offer here. We produce huge amounts of food on one of the driest continents on earth without any very few subsidies. There's great lessons in the way that agriculture is done in Australia. I think we've got a lot to offer the world in that sense, and making sure that others in other parts of the world know that. And I guess that's a lot of what ACIAR does. But yeah, just making sure that people are getting fed, and what are the sort of implications when that doesn't happen. We talk about climate refugees. Food systems and food pricing can also be a contributor to unrest and these sorts of things. So keeping that on the front foot and not getting sort of sidetracked by lots of development issues, climate, health, all these sorts of things. But agriculture has to remain relevant as well.
Yeah, I mean, for the Gates Foundation, there's a number of sort of priorities over the next 5 years, but maybe I'll speak specifically to the team. I'm on the Philanthropic Partnerships team, which I mentioned earlier, is focused on how to increase philanthropy writ large. And for us, our goal in the next 3 years, but really within a 10-year framework, is how do we accelerate more giving that advances equity? We have a target of seeing individual giving double over the next 10 years. Currently, it's about $350 billion a year in the US. We'd love to see that double to $700 billion. And we believe that high capacity givers, ultra high net worth individuals really have the potential to give more. And so we want to help them close that intent to action gap. So that's through a number of different innovations on how do you give at scale, but that is really a focus for us is how do you get more financing out there for improving global outcomes.
I think they're very broad and very tangible goals for the next 3 years. We have one final question from David, and he's asking, in a context of Australia, that we have 4 main organizations that we are funding, and there's very little support for local NGOs. What are your views for such funding? Maybe Alex, in that space, in Australia, New Zealand?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think as NGOs, in the NGO sector, especially local NGOs, we need to think about, what is our unique value proposition, or really how do we partner for impact? Because it is a sector that often we have many organizations specializing in different areas and kind of chipping away at different goals. And I think, we've talked a little bit about the need for more collaboration and more cross-partnership collaboration to address or to work on some of these wicked problems. So as smaller NGOs, how can we look at other ways of, if we're continuing not to be successful in applying for direct funding, how can we look at other ways of engaging, of partnering with maybe some of those larger NGOs, or partnering with other smaller NGOs or the private sector to be involved, and think about other ways of generating revenue, I guess, aside from just those, the large government donors. So can we look at social enterprise models? Can we look at, I guess, more progressive philanthropic foundations from the private sector? And really look at those private sector organizations, ESG strategies, like where are they looking to make impact? Is our NGO kind of have a differentiation there? So I think there needs to be a diversification away from our reliance on as NGOs on just the governments, but if we are targeting that, how do we make that one piece of the pie, essentially, and look for new ways to access some of that through partnerships.
Well, that's a big challenge there, Alex, that the idea of diversifying all our funding cycles. So thank you very much for throwing the challenge down to our funders globally and nationally, and also at a local level. I would like to thank all our participants and panelists, and we've got one final slide to go through. Jess, do you want to bring up the slides? We want to thank all our participants and would like to encourage you to be engaged with the Global Development Hub. And there's a number of ways that you can be involved in the Global Development Hub, and that if you just sign up for the monthly newsletter, and we'll get updates about the hub activities, and that's in that forum and that space you can share your ideas, showcase your work, join in the other networking activities, just like this workshop today, which I'm sure you've all had an amazing opportunity to hear some of the best and brightest organizations here in the world trying to solve the challenges of the globe, and also have an opportunity to present some of your ideas. So it's all a wrap up now. I would really love to thank Pippa, Anna, and Alex for your time and your really frank, open discussion, talking from failures all the way to what you're doing in the next 3 years to make the world a better place. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you, UQ academics and researchers and external people. And we look forward to the next session here. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.